All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Erin Mihal. I am the Assistant Director of Alumni Engagement here at Emory University. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping announcements for today's session. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in the Learning Development webinars are those of the individual speakers and do not necessarily reflect the official policy, position, or views of Emory University, the Emory Alumni Association, or its affiliates. The content provided in this program is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as an endorsement by Emory University or the Emory Alumni Association. This session is being recorded, so please be sure to keep your microphones muted to avoid disruptions, though we do encourage you to keep your cameras on. If you have any questions throughout the session, please feel free to share them in the chat box, and we will have a Q&A at the end of the session. I am also really excited and thrilled to announce that today's session marks the launch of our brand new Learning and Development Certificate of Attendance program. This exciting new initiative allows you to earn certificates for attending our webinars or watching the recordings. With consistent participation, you can unlock exclusive learning and development badges to showcase on LinkedIn, or other social media platforms. Plus, you will gain access to our private LinkedIn group where you can connect with our coaches and advisors and fellow lifelong learners. To receive credit for today's session, please type your name, first and last name, along with the email address where you'd like your certificates sent to into the chat. If you prefer to keep your information private, of course, feel free to send me a direct chat message instead. If you have any questions about the program, you can, of course, email me. I'll be sending out the recording and a survey after the end of this session. You can just reply to that. And we're excited to have you guys here and celebrate your commitment to professional growth and look forward to seeing you guys unlock new achievements. Now, for my favorite part, I'm so excited to introduce our featured speaker, Randi Braun. Randi is the Wall Street Journal bestselling author of Something Major, the new playbook for women at work, and the CEO and founder of Something Major, a women's leadership firm. She's also an ICF certified executive coach who has worked with powerhouse organizations like Microsoft, Uber, Virgin, Accor Hotels, and Cox Communications, just to name a few. Randi was honored as one of our Emory University's 40 Under 40 recipients for 2024, a testament to her incredible impact and leadership. Her expertise is in helping high-performing women thrive in demanding roles, has been featured in the Washington Post, Forbes, Parents Magazine, Thrive Global, and the Chicago Tribune. We're so fortunate to have her here with us today, and I know you'll leave today's session feeling inspired and empowered. Please help me welcome Randi Braun.
Thank you, Aram, and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming. As Aram mentioned, I'd love for you to introduce yourself in the chat. If you haven't already, please pop in where you're joining us from and how old your kids are. I know that this is a webinar about thriving and working parenthood, and so it'd be fabulous for me to understand, like, what are we working with here today? Do we have people who have newborns, who have teenagers? Today is a very special day for me. This is my 5th day back from maternity leave with my 3rd. And I realized that this is the first conversation I've had about working parenthood formally in the scope of my job as a professional speaker and coach since I became a parent of 3. So I'm joining from my home office in Washington, D.C., where I'm married to my spouse, who's a fellow Emory alum who I met on campus. And we have 3 children. We have an 8-year-old daughter, a 6-year-old son, and we have another son who just turned 5 months old the other day. So I'm just reading in the chat. We've got Taylor in Atlanta with a 6-month-old, Catherine with a 1-year-old in Atlanta, Ashley in Annapolis, you're in my neighborhood with a 7-year-old, 4-year-old, and 1-year-old, having an almost 3-year-old. So it looks like the oldest kids I'm seeing here are about 10 years old. So that's really helpful to see. And I'm also seeing that we have some people who have parenthood on their horizon, on their dream list, on their wish list. I see Lori here in Northern Virginia with twin 7-year-olds. Lori, you'll have to DM me and tell me where in Nova you are. I'm in Mount Pleasant in Northwest DC, so I have a hunch that we're neighbors. So really today is all about thinking about how we kick off 2025 as a year where we're really thriving and not just surviving as working parents. So in terms of how we're going to do this format, some of you have come to Emory events that I've done before, and so you're very familiar with my style. Some of you are new, and it's so nice to meet you. I like to keep these events as interactive as humanly possible. I'm going to be asking you questions in the chat. I want to take your questions. I'm not going to use slides. I'm going to talk about ideas. I'm going to take some questions from Nicole at Niram before I get to questions for you. One caveat, I know Iram kind of gave a caveat of all of the university's disclaimers. This is less of a disclaimer and more of an intention that I have for our time together. I always like to be conscientious of the fact that every single person joining this call, even though we all share a commonality in Emory, we're all different people. We're different learners. We're different leaders. We have different lived experiences, different origin stories, different family structures. And so I just want to say that nothing I share today is intended to be a prescription of Randi Braun says, this is the way to crack the code. If I take these exact 10 steps, I'm going to thrive instead of just survive this year of working parenthood. Rather, I want you to think of what we're discussing today as more of a buffet approach. I'm going to throw out a lot of ideas. I'm going to throw out a lot of real tools that I use with my real coaching clients to help them really feel like they can thrive at work and thrive at home. And my hope is really that every single person on this webinar leave with 1 to 2 things that move the dial for you. I'll actually know I've done my job if everyone here walks away with something a little bit different. So before we open it up to some structured Q&A and starting to take your Q&A, there was one thing that I just wanted to talk about today from the jump. And it's something that's been on the mind of a lot of my clients as I'm coaching with them. And frankly, even though this is only my 5th day back from maternity leave with number 3, it's actually my 3rd speaking engagement since I'm back, and I've spoken for about 1,000 people already since I've been back, which is kind of crazy. But this is something that's come up again and again and again already just this January, which is I'm hearing a lot from people around guilt. And I think there's something about January being the season of being the best you, being the new you, of setting goals, where we get into this guilt complex of feeling like anything we do for ourselves, we feel guilty about. We feel guilty about taking the time. We feel guilty about putting ourselves first. And so I just wanted to spend a little bit of time unpacking guilt. And before I go any further, I'd love to hear from you in the chat. Just throw me a "that's me" if you have ever felt some kind of parent guilt before, or some kind of guilt about letting other people down, right? I'd love to hear from you in the chat. Throw me a "that's me" if you've ever felt guilty about things. Thank you, Nicole. Amy says that's me. Aram says that's me. Okay, I know I'm hitting a chord when the chat starts to move faster than I can physically read it. So I'm glad that this resonates with people. And I want to ask you a question that I ask my clients all the time. When you tell me that you're feeling guilty, are you really feeling guilt? When you tell me that you're feeling guilty, are you really feeling guilt? A lot of times a client will come to me in coaching and they'll say to me, I wanna, get back into running, but I just feel so guilty taking that time away from my family on the weekend. I want to go on vacation, but I feel so guilty taking time away from my office because they're always so flexible with me. They gave me a great parental leave. They let me come late, leave early if I have a doctor's appointment, and I just don't want to let people down. And what I like to remind people is that guilt is the emotion that we feel when we act in a way that violates our personal code of conduct. So I'm going to say that one more time. Guilt is an emotion that we feel when we act in a way that violates our personal code of conduct. So when I think about things that govern my personal code of conduct, they're things like being honest, being respectful. So if I were to lie to my spouse, or if I were to lie to my kids, I might feel guilty because those are things that I truly value, and that would be crossing my personal code of conduct. But a lot of the times when I talk to working parents, when I'm working with them, coaching with them, and they tell me they feel guilty, the things that they're doing, going for a run on a Sunday morning, not checking your email for 2 days while you're on vacation, rescheduling meetings when you're having a snow day, or God forbid, if anyone is joining from LA or knows people who are affected with those horrific fires, right? A lot of times when we're rearranging our schedule for something unforeseen, what we're feeling isn't guilt. It's FOPO, it's regret, or it's feeling undeserving. And so I'm going to unpack those things. FOPO is the feeling that we have that is fear of other people's opinions. Okay? So I'm just going to type that in the chat for our visual learners. Fear of other people's opinions. And don't judge me by my typing or lack thereof. There we go. And a lot of times we say we feel guilt when we're actually feeling FOPO. We don't feel guilty about taking the run. We feel a fear of other people's opinions, that we're going to be a slacker mom, that we're going to be a bad mom, that people are going to think that we're a selfish parent, that people are going to think we're a slacker at work. So the next time you want to take some time to do something for yourself and you're feeling guilty about it, I challenge you to think, wait, am I feeling guilt? The feeling of violating my personal code of conduct, or am I feeling FOPO? And I tell people all the time, especially when it comes to self-care, if you're telling me that as a busy working parent, you feel guilty about your self-care, then really like maybe it's time to think of a different self-care activity. If your self-care activity really violates your personal code of conduct. But most of the time, we don't feel guilt. We feel FOPO, the fear of other people's opinions, that we're going to be viewed as selfish, as lazy, as a slacker. You know, we all are very married to these stories we have about ourselves, other people, and how other people view us. And what I tell people all the time is before you make decisions based on the story, do yourself a favor and gut check, is this story even fiction or nonfiction? Because there have been times in my life where I'm so married to the story about how things are, how someone sees me, who they are, what their character is, how they view my character. And then when I step back with time, I realize like, wait, I was so attached to a version of the story that wasn't necessarily nonfiction. So that's the first thing. The next time you're feeling guilt, I want you to think about, do I have guilt or do I have FOPO? Do I feel like this activity is crossing the line on my values, or am I afraid of how other people are going to view me for putting something I need first? That's FOPO. The second thing I hear people mistake for guilt is actually regret. And this is a really touchy one. And I'd love to see a +1 from you in the chat if you've ever made a decision, big or small, that you regret. I know I've personally made quite a few choices that I regret. And so a lot of times what happens is we say we feel guilty about making a choice when actually we regret making the choice. Right? I didn't really even like working. However, I said yes to the weekend. And I felt when I was there that I was just so racked with guilt. I felt guilty about going, guilty about taking the time away. And what I realized in retrospect was, wait, I didn't feel any guilt, regret. Because if guilt is the feeling of saying, hey, this choice isn't in alignment with my values, regret is the feeling of making a choice and then realizing we are unhappy with it. And the problem when we mislabel a choice we regret as a choice we feel guilty about is that we don't have the opportunity to learn from it. Or sometimes at work, we commit to taking that extra call. We commit to taking the meeting that really cuts into that time with our family. And we realized once we got on the call that this was not actually the trade off that we wanted to make. Our attendance on this call was not actually that important. Or we realized that our attendance on this call was actually so critical that we could have simply asked to have this meeting moved to another time because the meeting could not progress without our participation. So the next time that you feel guilty about something that you've already decided to do, I want you to think about, wait, do I feel guilty or do I feel regret? Because when we regret our choices, we can either A, make a new choice next time, or sometimes there's a chance to kind of clean up the mess and reconfigure the next steps forward. And then finally, the last thing that I think that we sometimes regret, pardon me, that we sometimes mistake as guilt, as high performing, career focused working parents, is that we feel undeserving. And a lot of times we say we feel guilty about leaning into a new opportunity at work when we really feel undeserving of that opportunity. We feel guilty about taking time away to do something for ourselves when we really feel undeserving of having the time to invest in ourselves. So as we kick off a new year, before we get into the Q&A, I just wanted to unpack that a little bit. I think guilt is one of the biggest things that holds us back as high performers, not necessarily from being successful, but from being in a place where we can enjoy our success, revel in our success, and help use that success to really drive us forward to the next milestones in career and life. So I'd love to hear from you in the chat. if this resonated with you. Do you find that you're a person who mistakes guilt for who mistakes FOPO, regret, or a feeling of undeserving for being guilty? I know Iram said that this idea of buyer's remorse resonated with her. So if that resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you in the chat. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Nicole and Ira, and would love to take some of the questions that we had submitted in advance. And most importantly, I really want to take your questions live. You are welcome to throw them in the chat. You are welcome to unmute yourself. I am really here to be of service to you. So if you took the time to show up live and you have a question about something that's holding you back about thriving in working parenthood this year, if it's something that you just can't crack the code on your stress, on your goals, on saying yes, on saying no, on rebounding when the plan blows up, on having a tough conversation, I am yours for the next 42 minutes. Hit me with any questions you have. And with that, Nicole and Iram, I'll throw it back to you.
Great. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Walker. I'm the Managing Director of Leadership Engagement within the Emory Alumni Association. And before we dive into the question portion, I do want to take a moment to celebrate you, Randi, because in addition to this being your 5th day back from maternity leave, it's also the around the time of the 5-year anniversary of your company, Something Major, which is, of course, a huge thing to celebrate. So I hope everyone here join me in giving you a round of applause.
Thank you.
Lovely. So I've been fortunate to hear Randi speak several times. The first was when I was, I think, about 5 months pregnant with my daughter, and the most recent was during one of my first weeks back from maternity leave. So you can definitely say that Randi's message has resonated with me quite a bit. But I'm excited to talk a little bit about some of what I've learned from you, Randi, and after we speak, we'll turn it over to the audience. So kicking things off, something that resonates a lot with me and probably those in the room is that it often feels like working parents are expected to do it all. How can we manage that overwhelming sense of having to juggle everything?
Absolutely. So I will answer that question in a second. I just want to take a moment to properly thank you, because, and I think everyone in the audience today will appreciate this, right? Like, there's just something that happens in the collision of your family growing years and your career growing years. And it's just pure math. And sometimes I think it's almost unfair that our ladder climbing years overlap with our career growing years, because it creates a circumstance where we have to make sacrifices and trade-offs, and we want to have it all and we can't have it all. And we'll talk more about that today. I think the idea of having it all can sometimes actually be very damaging. But I do want to thank you. And just pure coincidence, I did not even realize this when I put it back together, but yes, my first day back from maternity leave was last week, and it happened to be pure coincidence on the 5-year anniversary of my coaching business, Something Major. And so if you're also going through, whether you have a 10-year-old and you feel like you're at a place where you're still continuing to level up to your highest heights, or you're one of the people on here who has a kid under 1, and you are just trying to figure out what does it even look like to balance this all, I just want to let you know that we live in a culture where everyone feels like that is their own individual struggle. And I think that every single time we have a kid, every single time our kids get to a new phase, there's a moment of redesign in our life. And for me, having permission to redesign and reconfigure is something that helps me keep my sanity. So, Nicole, you talked about like the pressure to do it all. I will say that I think that one of the biggest things that we do as stressed out working parents, where we feel like there's too much on our plate, is we actually lean too hard into the productivity mindset as a way to kind of faux manage the stress. And I'll break that down a little bit and explain what I mean. A lot of times when we are overwhelmed, one of the things that we do is we lean into this feeling of doing it all to create a sense of faux control. So for example, if I'm feeling really stretched thin, maybe I put on my to-do list, like register the kids for camp, make a smoothie, turn over the laundry, go to the meeting. And at the end of the day, in doing it all, I've checked everything off on my to-do list, but I don't feel any less stressed. And so one of the first tools that I want to offer you is to, number one, understand where are you procrastinating inside your so-called productivity? In your quest to do it all, are you really actually trying to get it done? Or is there some form of procrastination here? Because it's easier to play whack-a-mole on the tasks than it is to do the big life redesign on understanding where you can have systems and assistance to do a little bit of redesign so that you're not facing that mountain every single day. That's number one. Number two is I want to encourage you to think about how can you be impactful versus how can you be productive? I think for me, that's been one of the biggest game changers in my life is understanding that my job in life is not to be productive. My job in life is to be impactful. So when I think about the productive mindset, for me, it's checking things off the to-do list. It's success is designed and defined rather as a individual sport. It's a lot of box checking. It's a lot of performativity, a lot of performing that I'll get back to everything quickly. When I think about being impactful, it's about doing the things that matter most and having good storytelling about how that's driving impact for other stakeholders. It's about leveraging my team to think of success as a team sport and not just my team internally in my company, but my team externally. So one of the things, I'm going to give you a tactical tip if anyone here is partnered. One of the things my spouse and I do every single Sunday night, it is the most unfun 20 minutes of my week, I'm just going to be honest with you, is we sit down and we have our weekly logistics meeting. And we look at our calendars and we literally go day by day and understand who has travel, who has after hours events, who is on call if a kid gets sick, what are the to-dos we need to do? Like, okay, you're signing them up for camp this week and I'm booking the plane tickets to go visit the family for the long holiday weekend. And we sit down and we make a plan. Because in my experience, Nicole, part of the pressure of doing it all is that we're constantly redesigning and playing whack-a-mole. And I find in our house, if we are able to create a baseline plan for how the week is going to go, what we're doing when things get disrupted, because I think every parent in here can relate, there is not a day that ends in Y as a working parent without some form of disruption, is that when we get a disruption, it is a pivot. It is not reinventing the wheel. And for me, that reduces my pressure to do it all because I already have a system in place for how it's going to happen. Two more tips that I'll give you here. Number one, I want you to think about where in your life you can design systems instead of making choices. I'm going to say that one more time. Where can you design systems instead of making choices? And I love this definition of systems from Eve Rodsky, who's a very famous author for her book Fair Play, which is all about creating gender balance, division of labor in the household. And what I would say about that is she says that designing a system around something is a way of automating the choice without having to make the choice. So I'll give you as simple an example as possible. We have a system in our house. I take my kids to the bus stop. My spouse picks up my kids from the bus stop. That's a system. We don't have to wake up every single day and decide how the choice is going to be made. The decisions happen. So I said I had two more things, but I'll actually just pause there because I know we have so many questions to get to. One day, Nicole, I am going to write a book just on productivity, and kind of undoing all the productivity myths.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure that this doesn't become a conversation just about productivity.
It could very easily, and I think a lot of people, especially within our generation, do get very hung up on the word productivity. So
Yes.
we'll save that one for a future conversation. Another really important concept that I know you embrace is self-care, being something that we should all prioritize, but it's so much easier said than done. Many of us do compare ourselves to those Instagram parents and the people who seem to do it all. And I know comparison really is the thief of joy. But how do you recommend that we make space for self-care when it seems like someone always needs something from us in the home?
Listen, I'm going to break this into two mini questions, which is influencers and self-care. My greatest wish for everyone on this call is that you stop parenting under the influence. And I'm not talking about the influence of drugs. I'm not talking about the influence of alcohol, right? I'm talking about the influence of social media influencers. I have an article, and Nicole, maybe we can send it out in follow up, that I wrote for Forbes last year about what I call the toxic wellness industrial complex. And there are people who are literally getting rich off Instagram and for at least a few more days off TikTok, wherever that goes. For those of you who are following that big Supreme Court case that's happening right now about the potential banning of TikTok, there are all of these places, all these people rather, who are literally monetizing your stress and your guilt. Literally, has anyone here ever heard of the 5-minute gratitude journal? Feel free to throw me a +1 in the chat. I almost fell out of my seat last summer when I was reading a profile of the people who who created the 5-minute gratitude journal in the New York Times. And I could not believe that they shared this with the New York Times. They don't even use their own tools. Literally, they were a hairstylist and a retail banker. I'm not dunking on their professions. And they tell the New York Times that they were basically looking for their $1 million idea. And they had no background in mental health, no background in wellness. They were extraordinary marketers. And today, they put out all this aspirational content about living your best life. And they sat and told the New York Times that they don't even use their own stuff. And so I think that it's so important to be really curious about like what you're seeing on your content feeds and not comparing yourself to those other people. And so please, 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 like take caution, because there are just so many people out there who are trying to convince you it's their program. One other example, Nicole, that I'll give you, there was an incredible article 2 years ago in the Wall Street Journal when the latest Magic Mike movie came out. And again, I could not believe that people sit down with world-renowned periodicals and tell people this stuff and put it in print. The whole marketing strategy for Magic Mike 3, I think it was that they did focus groups with stressed out working moms. I know not everyone in here is a mom, but they did a focus group with stressed out working moms. And their whole marketing for Magic Mike 3 and all the accompanying live shows was about being a wellness resource. This franchise is making billions and billions of dollars. And I'm not here to yuck your yum, but I think this might be the first time in Emory history anyone has come to a webinar and said this: you don't need strippers, okay? And it's like, this is the extent to which like these marketing influencers are coming up with the most cockamamie crazy things to try to sell to you. So that would be my first piece of advice, is like, take caution before you swipe your credit card. A lot of these people who are selling you things do not have your best interest in heart, let alone have any training in what you need to support yourself. As a busy working parent, there are so many things that are easy and free. Here are a few things that I personally do every single morning. I have a cup of coffee before I need to be on with my kids. I go for a walk in between my childcare time in the morning and getting to my computer. Just those are like a few really quick things. But I think even more than that, Nicole, when we set aside the influencers, when we think about the quick, free things, and by the way, Nicole, research from Harvard Business School shows that just taking consistent 30-second micro moments of self-care throughout your day, taking a few deep breaths, refilling your water, sending a quick text to someone that you love and who makes you feel good, can literally improve your productivity, how your stakeholders view you, and your satisfaction. Just consistent 30-second, what they call micro moments of self-care. But I think more importantly, and this is something I work on in depth with my clients, is that as high-performing working parents, a lot of times we have to unhook from the stories we have about self-care and be empowered to rewrite them. So in my book, I talk about 5 myths, 5 self-care myths, stories that I find that we tell ourselves that keep us at distance. And I won't talk about all 5, but I will just give you a few examples, because I'm a huge believer as a coach that we can't change our choices unless we're aware of the habits and the patterns that we're in right now. So Nicole, like one of those myths is, that myth of I should be grateful. Who am I to complain? I should be so grateful I have this great job. My kids are healthy. I know someone who has a kid with special needs and my kid is okay. Or I'm watching people in my company or my sector get laid off and I'm okay. And I'm here to tell you that you can be stressed and blessed at the same time. The other myth that I think we mistake a lot is the myth of maintenance for self-care. Maintenance are the activities, Nicole, that we do to keep ourselves functioning, right? Self-care are the activities that we do to keep ourselves flourishing. So I'll give you an example, Nicole. I was talking to a coaching client and she said, I don't understand. My self-care just isn't working for me. Like I took my solo trip to Target. I bought toilet paper. I treated myself to an extra lip gloss. I left my work phone at home. I listened to my favorite podcast and it didn't make me feel better. And I said to her, Nicole, I said, you weren't practicing self-care. You were grocery shopping. Right? We need to lift the bar. And I tell people all the time that when your maintenance is your self care, I see there's a lot of folks here from Atlanta and DC, two places that get very hot in the summer. Calling yourself your maintenance self care is like getting in your car on a 100-degree day and saying to myself, you know what? I'm going to treat myself to air conditioning today. That is not a treat yourself moment. That is literally not dying from heat stroke. And the last thing that I just want to say, Nicole, is that I think that we forget that our exhaustion, our self care is the only thing in our lives that might actually truly be life or death. So I tell this story in this book. I told this story to CNBC a few years ago. But in June 2020, if anyone here was parenting in the early days of COVID, I thought I had my exhaustion under control. I got in my car in the middle of broad daylight and I fell asleep driving my car. I crossed 6 lanes of traffic. I crossed a highway on-ramp and I stopped short in front of a pedestrian. For my people in the DC area, this was the intersection of New York, New Jersey, 395 Tunnel and M Street. If you're not in DC, you can just, from what that description is, hear that that sounds like a very busy thoroughfare. From what I can tell you is that even though I was stone cold sober, according to Harvard Business School, I was drunk because showing up to work chronically exhausted has the same cognitive impairment as showing up with a blood alcohol level above the legal limit to drive. And so I always tell people, if you wouldn't rip 3 shots of tequila and get on a Zoom with your stakeholders, if you wouldn't chug a beer and parent your kids, it's time to interrogate this. Okay, and the final thing I'll say before I take another question is that I genuinely believe that taking care of ourselves makes us a better parent. Like a few weeks ago, I took time on a Sunday afternoon to go to a yoga class. I came home right around the time my big kids were getting in bed. You have never heard me read stories the way I read stories that day. There were voices. There was commitment. The next night, I worked right until the second my kids got home, was completely stressed out knowing that like I needed to go out again after they went to sleep to another work event. I was short. I was irritable. I was not a mom I was proud to be. So I don't just think it makes us better professionals. I also think it makes us better parents.
Absolutely. And since you touched on COVID a bit in your last question, I wanted to ask you a bit about what you think has gotten easier about parenthood in the last 5 years and what's gotten harder, especially as we think about how work life for a lot of us has really bled into home life if you're working remote, like a lot of us do.
There's a great New Yorker cartoon, and it's like, wait, I forgot. Do I work at home or do I live at work? And I'm going to come back to Tao's question in just a second. But what I would say is, I really, I'm still blown away 5 years later by how much has changed. So I mentioned I have a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old, and I'd love to just see a +1 again in the chat if you have a kid under 2. I know that we had quite a few parents of young kids in here, and I know we have some parents of older kids too. Last Thursday was my first day back at work. The last time I went back to work 6 years ago, and then 8 years ago, getting back to work was an unfathomable scramble of getting up in the morning, feeding my kid, dropping my kid off at daycare. I live in DC, taking a train to work in Virginia, coming home and picking my kid up, and then bringing my kid home. Like, and having to be in a corporate environment and use all of the capital I had to leave every day 30 minutes earlier than the regular quote unquote close of business. Thursday, 6 years later from having my last kid, 5 years after the pandemic, going back to work where I could see my kid in the middle of the day. I posted a video about this if anyone here follows me on social media. Blew my mind. There is such a level of flexibility that is understood today. And I know, Iram, we were talking before that she has older kids. Like, The flexibility that parents have today is absolutely mind-blowing. And so if you're a newer parent and you still feel like it's hard, I'm not saying that to say that like in my day, you don't even know how hard it was, but I'm saying like I really want us to acknowledge that this is such a blessing and flexibility comes with its own challenges. One of the things that I find to be like the saddest thing about the current state of affairs is like we have lost things like a snow day, right? Because our workforce is so distributed that like when it snows in Atlanta, but your company is HQ'd in Chicago, they don't understand that like the city is not going to reopen after 3 inches of snow for 5 days. And so I think there's a lot more communication and boundary setting that happens. On the whole, I think that COVID has been a tremendous boost for creating a more humane approach to working parenthood for the companies that get it. And I think right now there's a lot of companies who are clawing back a lot of like, I'm not talking about the DEI initiatives, that's a whole separate conversation. But I've noticed companies clawing back even some of the flexibility. And I think the next stage that working parents, especially working mothers, are going to have to navigate is how do I need to repackage and recommunicate my value if I'm taking advantage of some of this flexibility or some of this remote work. And if you're a dad, someone who identifies as a dad on this call, and you're saying, well, what about me? I would say, I'm not saying it's necessarily easier or harder for someone, but part of my job as a coach, as a speaker, as an author is to be real about the research, not just about people's lived experiences. And one thing that we know about working fatherhood is that research from places like Cornell University shows that when dads parent in public, when they leave early to take their kids to the dentist, when they tell their coworkers that they spent their Saturday at a soccer game, their social capital goes up. Their trust goes up, their compensation goes up. When women parent in public, no matter how hard they're working, their social capital on the whole goes down. They're viewed as less committed. And it's a phenomenon called the maternity penalty. So again, if you're a dad, I'm not saying that what you do isn't hard. I literally couldn't live my life without the equal partnership of my spouse. But I think there are unique challenges that are gendered. And of course, there's all sorts of other intersectional factors. If you're a parent who identifies as LGBTQ+, if you're a person of color, there's all these different challenges that get refracted through the lens of parenthood that do impact the way we move through the world. And there's lots of great research on this. And I think this is a place where we need to go to the facts and have really fact-based conversations.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I want to give the audience time to ask some questions. So I know that Tao has asked a question already, and I'll go ahead and ask that on her behalf. But what are some examples of maintenance versus self-care?
Okay, I'm so glad that you asked this. So maintenance versus self-care, it's a very slippery slope, right? Because I hear from people all the time, like, no, you don't understand. I love cooking. And like when I'm putting on my music and chopping my vegetables, that brings me joy. I personally don't like cooking. And so the thought of cooking for me is the misery of making macaroni and cheese, but that's another conversation for another day. Okay, so here's how to think about maintenance versus self-care. Maintenance is doing an act for the sake of doing. I'm going to unpack that in a second. Self-care is doing an act for the sake of being. So when I'm doing maintenance activities, I'm doing the laundry for the sake of recycling fresh clothes. When I'm doing a self-care activity, like let's say I'm going to yoga, I am doing an activity for the sake of being relaxed, creative, rested, right? Do you see the difference? So maintenance activities, I think of as things that have to get done. I have to do laundry. I have to order groceries. I have to sign my kids up from camp. I have to do my commute. Okay. Now, there's no reason that you can't make maintenance activities more pleasurable. I have a longtime client who is a partner in a law firm in New York City, and she commutes in every single day from her house in Connecticut. She loved being locked down because she loves having those 90 to 100 minutes to herself a day. But she's in a culture that's very 5 days a week, and she has a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old. And so what she thinks about is, okay, how do I change my maintenance activity from a have to a get to? So on her commutes, instead of answering emails in the morning, what she's decided to do is that going to work, She has the Peloton app, so she does like a 30-minute meditation of just like breathing and closing her eyes and looking out the window. And on the way back, she listens to music and podcasts and really only tries to answer emails if it's truly time sensitive or if it's going to cut into the time that she has with her family when she gets home.
Mhm.
A self-care activity is doing something for the sake of being. So, for example, one of the things that she was talking about is like she really loves crafting. Like, and it was so funny. We were at a retreat. She shared this. I was like, I had no idea. I've known you for years. She's like, oh yeah, like I have like, she's like, I really love to put together scrapbooks. I really like to just like knit and crochet. And so for her, 5 or 10 minutes when she's decompressing at the end of the night and sitting down and doing that crochet, that is her actual self-care. And I want to remind you all that I think sometimes when we think about self care, we think about things like sleeping and exercising. There are 4 pillars of self care. There is our physical self care. So, like, think about it as the categories of like, I like to take a walk, I like to get good sleep, I like to eat healthy, I like to exercise. Those are all my physical aspects of self care. Then there's emotional self care. Think of that as how we take care of our brain and our feelings, right? So, like for me, part of my emotional self care is putting my phone away at times. Part of my emotional self care is carving out time to spend quality time with people I care about. Sometimes for me, it's talking to my coach. Sometimes for me, it's talking to my therapist. Like that's part of emotional self care too. Then there's intellectual self care. And I think of that because we're all a group of Emory alums. Everyone on this call, if you're on this call, is inherently a smart person. Because I've never met anyone I went to Emory with who wasn't brilliant. And that's using our brain for anything that's not work. So I'm a voracious reader. To me, reading is my intellectual self care. I love to listen to music, not while I'm doing other things, but literally for the sake of listening to music. And to Nicole, that point we had before about those 5 minute micro minutes of self care, how I know that Whitney Houston's We Almost Had It All is exactly 5 minutes is because sometimes when I have 5 minutes in between meetings, I swear to you, I open the door to this office, I leave this office, I go lay down on the floor, blast it on my phone instead of trying to like spontaneously send 3 emails. And that's my 5 minute reset. That's intellectual self care. And then finally, there's spiritual self care. So maybe you're a part of an organized religion like I am. For me, I observe Shabbat every week, and that's a huge part of my spiritual self care. Or maybe you're like meditation and mindfulness curious. And so it's not about saying that I have physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual self care equal at all times, but it's about remembering that there's a menu. And if you feel like you're in a self care rut, I encourage you to think about 2 things. Number one, which of those categories is my default? For a long time, physical was my default. And I found that when I leaned more into emotional, intellectual, and spiritual, it brought me to new places. And then number two, what's something you could get curious about? And guess what? If it's not working for you, it's not working for you. Last thing before I take the next question, I have people ask me all the time this specific question. I really want to read more, but I just can't get into it. My simplest answer is that, like, number one, are you sure reading's actually your self care? Like, are you sure you actually want to be a reader? Or are you just in this uber productivity mindset of feeling like a well rounded person reads and you're forcing it? Or number two, like, maybe you're reading the wrong content. Like, if you have a self help book on your nightstand that you haven't opened in 3 years, like, maybe you want to read a novel. I'm constantly reading a ton of fiction. It's something that keeps me really creative. So I'll just pause there, see how that's landing, and then I think we have a question from Shamika as well.
Absolutely. Yes. I really resonate with the book sitting on your nightstand for 3 years and not touching it. So maybe I need to,
That's all I can tell you.
not that one, of course. But we did get a great question from Shamika, and I think it is something extremely valuable for us to discuss. In Shamika's case, she mentions that she's curious how she can balance the little time left after handling all of those experiences and probably doing some of what you consider maintenance when it comes to professional and personal development, bonding with her toddler, playtime. How do you recommend balancing that when you might be doing parenting on your own or away from your family?
Tamika, this really resonates with me. I do not have any family support here in Washington, D.C. I do have a partner, but the closest grandparents live 220 miles away in New York and then 3,000 miles away in Los Angeles. And so when I see people who have parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles who are just constantly at the ready and helping, I marvel at them. My sister-in-law came to visit for a weekend a few weeks ago, and she said to me when she was leaving on Sunday, she said, I cannot believe what is required to make your life function. Like the amount of people who come in and out. A few things resonate here. Number one, when it comes to care, I'm a huge believer that like you've got to build your own care infrastructure. And for me, that was something that I learned really, really quickly. Was very simple. I did not have any family help here, and I ended up building what I can only describe as a small army of paid helpers to help me with very specific tasks. Everything from taking like Shamika, I'm always looking for things that are high quality time. And so what I realized when I was commuting to an office every single day was, my husband needed to be in the office basically by 7 a.m. every morning. Like he could not help with the morning commute. But the spending the extra 30 minutes of getting my kid to daycare and then making me kind of later to work was such horrible use of my time because I was just pushing her in a stroller. Like there was no quality time. And so I literally found a woman who lived in my neighborhood who came to my house every single day, rain or shine, and she took my daughter to daycare for me. And that gave me the chance to leave and get 30 minutes in the gym that I would have never had. So part of this is about building your own care infrastructure. Who is on your team? Who is on your bench? Like I literally think of myself as like the coach of like an NBA team, right? And it's like I need people who are going to play all the parts. That's number one. Number two, I want you to think about, Shamika, your task management. So especially as a high performing working mom, I find that we have a bias to doing it all. And we need to remember there's four D's of task management. Do, delegate, defer, or delete. I'm curious how much you're over indexing to do. Is it possible you could be delegating more? Is it possible you could be deferring? Is it possible you could be straight up deleting? Right? So I want you to think about who those people are who can help you. The first thing I do every morning when I get to my office is I don't look at my to-do list and make a to-do list for the day. I look at the to-do list I made before I left office the night before and spend the first 20 minutes of my day looking at what can be delegated or deferred to another time. And then lastly, I'm a huge believer in like really scheduling the time. So I know that this sounds silly, but I was just on maternity leave for 5 months. And I felt like if I wasn't careful, I wasn't going to have like quality time, snuggle time with this baby. Because as you know, postpartum, it can be kind of like boring and everything can melt. And this might sound really funny to you, but I actually said from 3 to 4 o'clock when the baby was really little, I was like, that's going to be the one time a day that like I do like a just really luxurious contact nap. And then I don't have to feel pressure the rest of the day to be like, are we snuggling enough? Are we doing it enough? And I felt like when I had that time structured, I didn't feel quote unquote guilty for throwing him in the stroller and running and doing my errands at Target because we had that quality bonding time. So I want you to think about like, what is the time you cherish the most with your toddler? What are those activities and how can you build them into your calendar? It's also so important to carve out time for personal and professional development. I find that when I take an hour out of my day to talk to my own coach, I just come back more productive. When I take a day out of my week to go to a retreat or a conference and learn, I swear my learning is unlocked and my creativity and productivity is unlocked. And that's not anecdotal, the research shows it too. So I encourage you to think about like running your calendar a little bit more holistically. And then I just want to follow up with Liz's question, Nicole, that I think is related, which is what are some of the types of care infrastructure? Okay, so a few. So I really, really rely on my partner. I rely on an army of babysitters. I also rely on everything like an Instacart shopper. There's a great book by Dr. Ashley Willens called Time Smart. She's a business professor at Harvard Business School, rather an organizational psychologist. And her whole thesis is basically that we're like constantly doing bad math on our time. And we think that we're saving time, we think we're saving money, and we're actually hemorrhaging and losing both. So I'm a huge, I don't know my Instacart driver, but I tip really well, and they're a part of my care infrastructure. And the other thing I would say is friends and community. As kids get older, I'm a huge believer in like calling up a friend and being like, honestly, like right now, it's just too much for me. would you be willing to take my kids for a play date on Sunday? Like, I need a break. And I think that that's absolutely huge. So those are a few tips that I have. And I know we're not done yet, but I do just want to say in particular to anyone who has kids that are under 1 or 1.5, I am putting together a cohort of us this winter. So if that's something that you're interested in learning more about, I know sometimes people have to hop early, please reach out to me because I think no matter whether you're a third-time mom like me or a first-time mom, it's really hard and it's really isolating, especially if you're a career-focused mom. So please, please feel free to contact me because there's just so much more to unpack about that there. But Nicole, back to you on the next question.
Absolutely. And we can round it out with this final question. Going back to guilt, which I think is a very common theme, but how do you deal with guilt, with the guilt of rest or not being productive enough? Again, you've mentioned being high achieving. I think probably everyone graduating from Emory or within the Emory community can probably identify with that. But how do you deal with that?
Yeah, and as I answer this question, what I'm gonna go ahead and do is just share my social links. Can you all see them on? Okay, yeah, I'm just gonna share my social links. That way, if people wanna keep in touch, you can take the time while I'm answering this question to either scan on LinkedIn or scan on Instagram. I know a few of you have already DM'd me here in the chat. And so this is a great DM me on those platforms so that I can actually follow up with you when we're done. Okay, here's the thing, Nicole, like I used to think that my value was based on what I could accomplish in a day. And I remember, especially when I was in my old job, I had my 2 kids in 2 years and 6 days, the first two. I negotiated a pregnancy. I negotiated a huge promotion in the middle of my first pregnancy. I came back to a boss who had granted that promotion, but I felt like constantly punished me every single day for taking the time off. And I noticed that a lot of what I was doing was really performative. Like I would get back on my email at 7 o'clock after my kids went down, even though there was nothing I needed to do that was actually time sensitive. But what I would do is I would send about 30 to 40 emails a night that basically had this in their context. Sounds good. Sounds good. Sounds good. Thanks. Thanks. Yes. No. Like literally one word answers to prove that I was on and working. And I think sometimes as working parents, we feel like we have to sing for our supper a little bit and we overcompensate. So that's one perspective I have that's a little more personal. Zooming out into like more of a tools perspective, I was asked the other day, like what my greatest hack is for overcoming exhaustion. And it's so simple, Nicole, it's rest. And I know that that sounds really, really, really simple, but I'm telling you, there's not a moment where I feel like I haven't taken a beat for 30 seconds and come back stronger. Like, I don't know about you, but there's never been a time in my life where I sat at my computer for 9 hours and I was like, "Hi, George, I've just got the best idea I've ever had," right? Everything we know about performance and productivity is that we have rest. Like, look at the way the World Series goes. These are professional athletes at the top of their game. They do not play every single game back to back to back. There are rest days, there are travel days, there are rest days from the travel days. And sometimes I think we need to treat ourselves less as like bionic robots and more like the elite athletes that we are. And I find for me, sometimes like taking on that Olympian, like train hard, rest hard mindset's really helpful. And the final thing that I want to say here too is that back to the first question where it started with balance, is that balance and rest are not perfect every single day. I remember when I was on my book tour, for 5 months, I was relentlessly on the road. There were days where I could be in 3 time zones in 72 hours. And the idea of having balance or having rest was ridiculous. It was like I would take it where I could get it, but this was like a literal once in a lifetime opportunity thing. And sometimes you rise to the challenge. And what my rest ended up being, Nicole, was that after pushing myself for 5 straight months, I took 2 months over the summer as a mini sabbatical, a mini recovery. Like sometimes balance and rest are truly meeting the moment of a push yourself through it and then design or snatch the lull and really lean into it. And I think a lot of times what prevents us from doing that is that we have false urgency, that everything is a rise to the occasion, make or break moment. The most successful working parents I know have the strongest self-care game. And it doesn't mean that they don't answer the phone call at 11 p.m. when it rings. It doesn't mean that they don't operate from a sense of excellence. But like, I used to coach a woman who was a C-level executive, and she was also in a rock band. That's not a coincidence. The highest achievers are people who have really cracked the code. And back to those micro moments of rest, the last thing I want to leave you with is, what's your game plan to get a few minutes of rest a day? What's your game plan to have meaningful rest every single week? And then how do you actually plan those things out? Like, look a quarter ahead. Do you have vacation plan for Q2? Put it on the calendar right now. So I think so much of this takes planning. And back to the influencer thing, all the people who are making it look effortless, they're not effortless. In fact, some of them are either they're selling you snake oil, or I know some of these people, they're actually like really stressed out all the time, and they're caught on this flywheel of performing a brand that doesn't even represent them. So I'd love to hear from you all in the chat before we go. Like, what's one thing that you're taking away from today? What's one thing that you're taking away from today or that you're going to implement? As we wait for those to come in, I just want to say this has been so life-giving. Please feel free, for me, like it's my 5th day back and this is really re-energizing for me. Please feel free to follow me on social media, to DM me there. I post so much free content. My website, somethingmajorcoaching.com, has so much free content. We're also doing tons of free events starting in February. So if you're looking for a new job, we have a free event for that. If you're coming back to work, we have a free event for that. They're so hot off the press, they're not even on the website yet. So if you just DM me on social media, I'll make sure I get you those links. And this is the last thing I'm going to say, Nicole. My door is always open to an Emory alum. If you have a question, if you want to, if the thing about FOPO really interested you and you want to know where you can read a great article about it, Nicole knows this. I do all my own social media. I answer almost every single DM I get. If I missed it, it's because I honestly missed it. So follow up with me. But I really, really appreciated this time. And I just want to read a few of these takeaways. Being intentional about creating systems. Maintenance is not self-care. Micro moments. FOPO versus guilt. Designing systems. Being more cognizant. Automating choices. Like I said, Nicole and Aaron, before I pass it over to you, I said I would know I've done my job if everyone here is walking away with something different. So I feel like I did my job, and I'll pass it to you to do yours.
Thank you. Thank you. And I agree with everything that people are saying in the chat. I think the biggest thing I'll take away is not confusing FOPO with guilt, and maybe being more willing to let go of that. So thank you everyone for joining us. I'm going to turn it back over to Iram to close us out today.
Yes, thank you once again. Great session. Thank you all for being here and engaging in today's session in the chat. Keep an eye on your inbox. You will receive an email soon with the link to a short survey. We'd greatly appreciate if you could take a few minutes to share your feedback. We're also excited to invite you to our next event on Wednesday, January 29th at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. Join us for a dynamic coffee and conversation as we delve into the current and future landscape of AI with Dr. Rajiv Garg. And the discussion will be facilitated by another one of our 40 under 40, Ryan Green. You won't want to miss it. On behalf of the Emory Alumni Association and everyone here, thank you guys so much for learning and growing with us. We look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Thanks, Iram.
Thank you.